about Jesus. It's better than any treasure. Every single March, I always think about this little thing I got in my hand. I don't know if you can see what it is. It's a piece of a basketball net. If you follow basketball at all, you know what it means when they say, cut the nets. It means your team has won a major championship. That was back on March 9th, 1974, when the Anderson County High School basketball team that I was a part of was playing Scott County. We were playing for the 8th Region Championship at Henry County High School. And the winner would go on to the state tournament at Freedom Hall in Louisville. The loser would see a fantastic season in. Now, I was the manager of the team, but I had a lot of responsibilities. I took care of the statistics, took care of equipment, did all kind of things, more than most managers do nowadays. It was just different back then, and I was considered a part of the team. I was on the roster and all that. So we were in this game, and it was back and forth from the opening tip. It was just a few seconds remaining. There was a timeout call, and we were ahead 55-54, but Scott County had the ball. And they came down, and their best player, who actually played college basketball, shot. And just before the buzzer, and we all held our breath, when that shot, though, fell off the rim, our entire bench ran onto the floor, hugging each other, jumping each other, and we cut the nets. In those days, it wasn't like today, where they wait for somebody to bring a ladder and you climb up there. In those days, what did you do? Two of the biggest guys would lift up somebody, and somebody would throw them a pocket knife, and you cut it down like that, and that's how you cut the nets. The next day, though, when we gathered together for the coach to tell us what to expect when we went to the Sweet 16, he gave everyone one of the nets. We had two nets, one was on the trophy and the other went to us. This is something that is really worthless. But to me, it's a great night of my teenage years. And you know something? There's no way I'm going to part with that. I'm never going to part with this. It's important to me. I also own this. I'm not sure when I got this little thing. I think I was 4 years old when I got this little thing. We lived on a farm. I said, if you can't tell what it is, it's a John Deere tricycle. And it looked just like our old John Deere B, if you know what I'm talking about. Our old John Deere, they call it the Poppin' John, you know, pop, 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 pop. We had one of those, and this was just like the folks, those things were cool. And I was a little boy, always wanted that, and one Christmas morning, I got up, this was under the tree. I rode that thing everywhere. When I outgrew it, my parents gave this to my uncle in Louisville for his son to ride around Louisville. Then, when he outgrew it, guess what they did? They gave it back to me, and later my children also rode that thing. It's been through a lot. It's been through a lot. It's had some wear, but you know something? It's a treasure to me. It's an absolute treasure. Jesus talked about treasures. Let's look at Matthew chapter 13, verses 44 through 46. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is that valuable. It's that valuable. It's a treasure like none other. And I think that what Jesus is saying here is that God's kingdom is so valuable that it's worth every effort we can muster in finding it, and even more. That's how valuable God's kingdom is. It's how much of a treasure it should be to you and to me. So I want to see what Jesus says about that treasure as we look at Matthew chapter 13 today. The first thing I want you to remember is that the struggle against the world is real. It's not easy to be a Christian. It's not easy to pursue Christ in a world that is so corrupted by sin. But oh, what a treasure it is to have God's kingdom when we find it. Nothing else can come close to comparing to that treasure of God's kingdom. Look at the picture Jesus was saying about being in God's kingdom was all about. Look at the picture he said. He painted this picture, and in those days, you think about what he said. He was talking about a man plowing in a field and finding a great treasure. Now, in ancient times, you just weren't able to go into Walmart or somewhere and buy a Century safe or something like that to keep your treasures. There were systems that may have resembled the bank safe deposit box that we sometimes have today. That system dated back maybe even 1,000 years before Christ, that people would give them, yet they would turn their possessions, their treasures, over to someone powerful to take care of these treasures in a locked safe, locked box, even before Jesus Christ came. But the most common way for most people to take care of their treasures was very simple. What was it? Dig a hole, bury it in the ground. Makes sense, doesn't it? You just dig a hole and bury it in the ground. It was considered a safe place, even during times of war. It wasn't uncommon for people to bury their treasure, go off to war, and then be killed, and that treasure would be in the ground. Nobody would know it was even there. It was a common practice. Jesus was describing a scenario that perhaps his listeners had dreamed of, finding this great treasure while you're plowing. They might have even known someone that had happened to. They might have even experienced it themselves. You might have found some kind of treasure in your own life. You might find it in your own backyard, wherever. But this is what Jesus was describing. It was a hired hand who discovered this treasure chest while he was plowing. He stopped, he digs it up, looks in the lid, and he sees these enormous treasures. He can't believe it. But he knows that he can't just take those treasures. He can't just run off with them. So he reburied them and did it right, did it honestly, continued to work, and the whole time he's planning his next move. He's thinking, how can I get that treasure legally? And what does he do? He sells everything he has, every single thing. Can you imagine what his family and friends thought? To sell everything he had. I mean, every single thing he owned, his livestock, his house, everything. Didn't make sense to them. Probably didn't make sense to anyone else. But as Kyle Idleman says, it was probably the best investment he could make. That's how important that treasure was. Jesus says that's how good the kingdom of heaven is. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. A treasure that someone sees and he wants it so bad that he sells everything he has to buy the field. Folks, we face struggles. A lot of times we talk about the struggles maybe being opposition But the struggles sometimes that we face are from within. They're our own wants. We face many struggles of things that the world wants, the world treasures, but they're temporal. Think about it. Money. Jesus talks a lot about money, does he not? He talks about it a lot. Now, I haven't taken the time to count this out, but I recently read where of the 38 parables Jesus gives in Scripture, 16 are about money. That's a pretty good percentage, is it not? Jesus talked a lot about money. The world sees money as a treasure, does it not? Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is greater. Pleasure. You know, during my teenage years, there was a very prominent beer advertisement that some of you might remember, some of you older people, says, grab all the gusto you can. Do you all remember that? Anybody remember that? Grab all the gusto you can. And it was set with fun time. Then that company followed it up with another ad campaign that said, go for the gusto, implying that fun times are what you should be doing. I find it interesting that an interesting side note of that is that the company that ran those commercials, Joseph Schlitz, has been sold twice since then. It was one of the top sellers at that time, and now it's not even close. I wouldn't know. I just found that in some research. But, you know, go for the gusto. Grab all you can. The pleasure. Status and power. And think about history. History is littered with stories of those who pursued fame and fortune, yet it was fleeting and lost it. Folks, I can't help but think of this and think of Michael Jackson. Everybody here knows Michael Jackson, don't you? Everybody here knows who Michael Jackson is. He was a child star with the Jackson 5 in the 60s and 70s. Michael Jackson became a solo entertainer when he was 13 years old. His Thriller album, does anybody here have that album, by the way? Anybody have it? Whew. But his Thriller album, which was released in 1982, he was 24 years old. That album is the greatest selling album of all time, reportedly selling over 70 million copies. In 2018, Forbes magazine reported that in his lifetime, Michael Jackson earned $4.2 billion. You have to think of him. What do we know Michael Jackson for besides his music? He was troubled. Extremely troubled, was he not? He was extremely troubled. There was multiple sexual abuse charges levied against him. His behavior was often considered bizarre. And then in 2009, he died of an overdose of prescribed drugs. Prescription drugs. In 2009, when he died, NBC reported that he was $500 million in debt. Earned $4.2 billion and was still $500 million in debt. Folks, I cannot comprehend that. I cannot comprehend that. But people search that fame and fortune constantly. Prestige. You know, my background's that of a sports writer, and I saw that people pursuing that with athletic scholarships. The sports fan in me cringes at how people spend thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars on travel ball and individual instruction, hoping to get that elusive scholarship that rarely happens. And when it does happen, it's often far below their expectations. And I just never could figure out why we spent so much time and money for something that had the odds so stacked against them. I can give you many other examples of prestige, any of these four things. Money, pleasure, power and status, prestige, any of these. Those are just a few. Those things can bring some temporary happiness, but that's the thing. When it's temporary, what does that mean? It doesn't last. This net I showed you, man, we thought we were on cloud 9 on Saturday night when we won that game. On Wednesday night when we played Louisville Central in the state tournament, we lost by 30 points. You know, it didn't last very long. The next year we were supposed to be in the top 10 in the state. We lost in the regional tournament. We didn't make it back. That little tractor that I love, you know what that little tractor basically does? It takes up space in our storage shed. And I don't know how many times Stephanie and I have argued. What does Stephanie say? I want to sell that thing. And what do I say? Don't you dare. In fact, a few years ago, we had a yard sale and someone saw that. And they offered to buy it. And they offered a pretty good amount of money. I don't remember what it was. It was several $100s, was it not, Stephanie? And I looked at Stephanie and I said, don't you dare sell that thing. Because why? It's treasure. But you know something? You know what's going to happen? My grandkids, my kids don't want it. Neither do my grandkids. Someday they'll probably be sold at my estate sale. That's what's going to happen. You know this little net? You know what will happen? It'll be in my office till the day I die. Then when somebody's cleaning it out, you know what they'll do? They'll throw it away. Because it's temporary. It's a temporary treasure. When we realize that, we have to remember what Solomon said. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God. Keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. God's kingdom is worth everything. That's the second point today. God's kingdom is worth everything. That sounds so obvious and so apparent. But far too many people claiming to follow Jesus Christ really don't have that attitude. That's part of our American culture, that we have allowed so much to come between us and our relationship with Jesus. But look again at what Jesus said about how valuable God's kingdom really is. Look at Matthew chapter 13 and verse 44 again. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. This guy had this treasure, but he couldn't just gaze at it. He didn't want to just look at it. He buried it and sold everything he had to buy that field. Think about that. He got rid of all that he had to obtain that treasure. Let me repeat that. He got rid of everything he had to obtain the treasure. The treasure in the field. And Jesus says that's what God's kingdom is. Nothing else is worth anything compared to His kingdom. This week, Stephanie and I took in some of the sights and the lessons of Washington, D.C. and the surrounding area. And on Friday, we closed out the trip. We thought it was going to be just a couple hour stay, but we closed out the trip with an all-day stay in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, if you know anything about the history of the American Civil War, you know that Gettysburg is where perhaps the most important battle of the Civil War occurred. At least the tide turned in the Civil War at Gettysburg. It was in 1863 in the summer. And the war between the states had been raging for over 2 years. And a Confederate general who had actually turned down President Abraham Lincoln's offer to command the Union forces, was leading the Confederate troops. His name is Robert E. Lee. And he'd been defeating and in many instances embarrassing the Union Army all over Virginia. And Lee believed that if he pushed north into Pennsylvania and secured a victory on northern soil, that it would lead to the end of the war and give the South what it wanted. However, if you know anything about Gettysburg at all, you know that Lee was very close to victory, not once, but twice in the three-day battle. But on the third day, Lee withdrew his forces after the Union troops, who were under the direction of General George Meade, repeatedly held the line. Now, it was a crushing defeat for the South, but what has always stuck out for me that day about Gettysburg, I knew this even before we went there, was that between the two armies, over 7,000 men were killed. Over 33,000 were wounded, and over 10,000 prisoners of war were captured. And over 160,000 men were fighting a battle, close battle, just outside a little town of 2,400 people. Stephanie and I visited that battlefield. It was where Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address a few months later, but Stephanie and I visited that battlefield Friday. And if you ever go, you'll find that battlefield is preserved very much like it was in 1863. In that respect, the hills, the little round top, the big round top, are there just as they were in 1863. So is the Devil's Den, and there's over 1,300 monuments showing where the different regiments were during the Battle of Gettysburg. It was our first time there, and we took the guided tour, and it was very educational. But one thing that stuck out in my mind, it stuck so well that when we got back, I asked Stephanie, I'm going to put this in my sermon, and I want to make sure I got this right. She said, I heard it exactly right. One thing that the guide said that just stuck in my mind was that soon after the battle, the townspeople realized the significance of what had happened there and started buying up the land to preserve the history and keep that land from being settled or developed. Eventually the federal government stepped in, and that park has nearly 1 million people visit annually. But the people saw the value of the land, and they did whatever they could to make sure that that land stayed like it was in 1863. That's how much they treasured it. But think about it. 160,000 men there, all of them have died. Despite losing at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee is considered by many one of the greatest generals ever. And he played a significant role in bringing our country back together after the Civil War. But you know something? He passed away in 1870. George Meade is not well known to many people. Unless you're in the military and you know that there's an important base named after him in Maryland, Fort Meade. His victory at Gettysburg is one of the most important in American history. Yet he died in 1872. But what about Jesus' kingdom? How valuable is it? People saw the value of what was going on at Gettysburg, that they wanted to make sure that people knew about it. What about Jesus' kingdom? It's worth so much more. What did Jesus say to Peter? On this rock I will build my church, and what? The gates of hell will not prevail against it. That's why God's kingdom is so valuable. His kingdom is made up of men and women who live by faith in God's grace and His power, and it will never fail. Unlike any earthly country, God's kingdom will not be overcome. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Unlike any of these world's treasures, It will not rust. It will not fade. Remember what Jesus said? And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Several years ago, Reader's Digest ran a story about a farmer in Romania. Back in 1955, he lived behind what was known as the Iron Curtain, which is an imaginary line between free Europe and communist Europe. And communism had taken over Romania, and it deemed everything belonged to the state. So before the state could confiscate his tractor, he dug a hole, took the tractor apart, dug a hole, wrapped it in tar-covered cardboard, and buried it in his backyard. 35 years later, after the Berlin Wall came down, the laws had changed. He dug that tractor back up and put it together again. It was a treasure to him. But you know something? That tractor, that little tractor I showed you, or any other tractor, any other earthly treasure, can't compare to God's kingdom. So that leads us to the final question. What is God's kingdom worth to you? Today's Father's Day, and there's no more pertinent question on Father's Day than what does God's kingdom mean to you? What does it mean to you as a father, as a mother? What does it mean to your family? Are you, as a father or a mother, more interested in your child being a great student, maybe having straight A's, than being a fully sold-out follower of Jesus Christ? If not, if you're not fully pointing them toward Jesus Christ, then you don't see the kingdom of heaven as a treasure. If you dream of your child hitting home runs in Yankee Stadium, or running for touchdowns at Rose Bowl, or hitting three-pointers in the NBA, but don't put as much effort, or don't put more effort into ensuring that your child is developing a lifestyle of following Christ, you're chasing the wrong treasure. Do you, regardless of your family status, place an emphasis on your new car, the latest gadget, at the expense of being a radical follower of Christ? If so, then you have the wrong treasures. Remember again what Jesus said. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. There's a song that we often sing here that captures what Jesus said. I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have Jesus than riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by his nail-pierced hands. Say it with me, of course. Than to be the king of a vast domain, be led in sin's dressed way. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today.